Graham, I think we're good to go now.
Okay, brilliant. We have a number of participants in the room. I think that's great. Kevin, can I ask you, while I'm doing the introduction, to admit more people as they come on board? I might not notice that while I'm doing a quick introduction. Is that okay, Kevin?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, welcome everyone to the Waveney May Day Festival. It's organised by the Waveney TUC and friends. Hopefully, I'm one of those friends. My name's Graham Elliott, and I'm your host and chair for this afternoon. I'm a local councillor for Beccles and Worlingham, and I'm just enjoying a short break from my council work, the community response to the COVID-19 crisis, which is taking up a lot of time, and perhaps most important of all, our smallholding. It's a great privilege to chair this important event on behalf of Waveney TUC. Please keep your microphones muted when not invited to speak. We don't really want to broadcast your dogs and your children and your phones. It'd be really useful if all devices were on silent. If you do want to speak, you can unmute yourself by pressing the space bar or the unmute button at the bottom of your screen. It does feel rather strange to be separated and coming together via video link. We're living through exceptional times and are making extraordinary changes to the way we live. The current crisis does show very clearly that we can make these extraordinary changes when there is political and social commitment. The COVID-19 crisis will, in time, recede and be consigned to history, and we will return to some kind of normality. But my view is it must not be the normal from which we came. The scale of the change we need to make is for this crisis is comparable to that which we need to make to tackle climate change. But in the fight against climate change, these changes must be permanent. The COVID-19 crisis shows us that we can do it. The climate crisis requires that we must do it. But we must do it in a way that promotes social justice. Governments have just taken huge powers, and these could be used in a way that is very detrimental to social justice. Today is a celebration of workers' solidarity. But what I've learned today is that this workers' May Day celebration originated in the 1880s in that hotbed of socialism, the United States of America. But it's now a worldwide celebration and has been marked by Waveney TUC for many years. And I think it's fantastic that millions of people are recognizing our health workers and our key workers every Thursday evening. But we need to do more than clap for our carers. We need to make sure they're properly paid and appreciated all the time. The TUC will mark International Workers' Day today with a social media campaign with five campaigns really within that. There's a campaign to ban 0 hours contracts, to increase sick pay to real living wage, to award a fair pay rise for public sector workers, to set a £10 minimum wage for everyone, and to bring outsourced workers back into the public sector. Tackling these basic social justice issues must be an integral part of tackling climate change. But to start our event, I'd like to introduce film director Steve Sprung and to show an abridged version of his film, The Plan That Came Up From the Bottom. Now, the full 3-hour version of the film will be screened tonight. I think it's at 7 o'clock, and there will be a link to that on our screens in a few minutes, or maybe even now. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Steve to say a few words about himself and the film, and then we'll kick off with the abridged version of the film itself. So over to you, Steve.
Oh, sorry, can I just ask how long you want me to talk for?
You've got as you like, but I anticipated about 10 minutes, but we've got longer if you need it.
No, I don't need it. I just didn't want it. I didn't want it too long. Anyway, first of all, let me. It is a bit strange actually being in a room with the computer screen. I'm assuming there are people out there. I'm just saying thank everybody who's out there who's going to participate in this event and also watch the film hopefully later on. The short film now and the longer film later on. Yeah, first of all, let me just say, there's different versions of this film. The film is called actually The Plan That Came From the Bottom Up. and there's different versions of the film. There's a 30-minute film, which is going to be shown shortly, I think, yeah. And I made that specifically as a request, people requesting a short film that could be shown in the context of meetings, where obviously a longer film wasn't possible. But the film that I made originally, the long film, which is going to be shown later on this evening, is a 2-part feature film. Part 1 is 120 minutes, 2 hours, and part 2 is an hour and a half, 90 minutes. And in a sense, what I want to do now is slightly maybe explain why it's such a long film. My intention when setting out to make this film wasn't ever to make a long film. I have no interest in making a long film, but it became that length out of necessity. And the reason it's that long is because he's trying to tell the whole story of the Lucas project, the Lucas plan as it became known, but it's trying to talk about it in terms of talking about the process, the whole process of the whole thing, because I think it's very instructive for all of us to see how the process of it, how it took place, yeah. And by process, I mean also going back to what preceded it. What were the things which led to those workers coming to those conclusions and the need to make this plan? The plan itself, and also then what developed out of it, the incredible things, the amount of things that they got into and developed out of it. Yeah. So the reason the film is that long, it covers all of this, covers all the whole gamut of that. And in a sense, what it tries to do, it's based on 2 things. It's based on an interview with 5 of the workers that was done over a number of days of interviewing with them, and they tell the whole story. And it's also based on archive material from the time that I'd filmed and various people had filmed. But the way in which the interview works is I was very much interested in trying to capture the sort of their changing consciousness as they move from a position of I'll do a job to I'll make anything, because a job gives me money and a means to live, and I'll moving from that position to the position where they questioned what it is they were making and raised that a very basic question about what because they were making arms, working in an armaments company essentially. And they moved from a position of saying, well, we'll do anything, to questioning the ethics of that and questioning the whole social meaning of that, and to make a plan about, which raised other possibilities to make other things. Not only did they make a plan, but they went from that basic, simple question, why am I making this? Why can't we make something else? To eventually setting up, for instance, a research department, the first worker academic research centre within a university. They actually funded it. They raised £60,000 in the 70s to develop a 3-year research project into alternative technologies. So they go from a simple question of how do you defend jobs by making something different to end up developing an actual research department. And so the whole of that process, I think, the way in which they changed as people in doing that, in making that process, the way they brought workers into the whole thing, the way they brought in and developed the creativity of the workers in Lucas Aerospace, and brought forward and nurtured that creativity to come up with these alternatives, is what the film tries to capture in terms of how they talk about it. In a sense, their sort of learning process, I suppose, right? Now, the film does that, and it also tries to do another thing. It sets the whole of what they did in context. It sets it in the context of the neoliberal world order that was developing as they were developing their alternative plan. And I think it's important we remember that neoliberal world order was developing not under Thatcherism, but pre-Thatcher, under the Labour government, because the whole of this project, the Lucas, took place under a Labour government. It prefigured Thatcherism, yeah? And of course, that neoliberal sort of world that was being brought into place is the exact opposite of what the Lucas workers were all about. They were about the idea of developing things for social need. They were about developing things which had environmental sustainability. And the neoliberal world was about brute profit, the reasserting of the power of brute profit over workers. Because we've got to remember, at that point in history, really, the working class through its trade unions, etc., had got to the point where it was challenging capital's ability to make profit. A bigger percentage of the actual outcome of industry, etc., or the national income was going to workers than they'd ever gone to before because of their success as trade unionists, simply as trade unionists, yeah? And the brute force of neoliberalism was to, you know, bring in the attacks on trade unions, and again, which started under a Labour government. The first attacks on trade unions were 1969 in place of strife, prefigured everything that took place under Thatcher. Privatisation brought in deregulation of finance, and the whole associated culture of neoliberalism was being brought in at the point where the Lucas workers were starting to mount their campaign. And by the end of their campaign, an 8-year campaign, when ultimately a number of workers got sacked when Thatcher came into power, the whole aim and of their developing these ideas about social need above profit was basically crushed under the brute force of the neoliberal boot, essentially. Yeah. So the film tries to set that context of why it couldn't take place at that time, or why it can't take place under a capitalist economy. And the film is, in a sense, the difference between the longer film and the shorter film is that the longer film is a kind of reflective film. It reflects on this whole process. And it starts from a question, really, in a certain sense, the question of why is it that the Lucas project, I've got Graham Elliott's come up on my screen. Am I talking too much? Hello?
Fine, carry on.
Oh, okay. Sorry. If you I'm talking too much, just tell me to shut up. So it reflects. The first question it asks is why was the Lucas whole Lucas plan project forgotten, and why? And it poses that question, and it tries to pose the question not just in terms of why it was forgotten, the actual products, but why was the whole process is the idea of bottom-up planning, and the involvement of workers in their communities forgotten. And I think partially, sorry, I've unmuted my microphone. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Sorry. I must have done something here. I want to a little story about something that happened when I first because I started making the film, getting the Lucas workers together to make the film. And then there was a conference organized with a bunch of other people as well in Birmingham in 2016, a sort of celebration of the Lucas, what the Lucas workers did. And something that really stood out to me when I was at that conference, there was someone not speaking at the conference, but who got up from the floor and made a contribution. And he was a well-known convener from a car factory. And he got up and he said he now considered himself an environmental activist. But throughout the period of the late 60s into the 70s, into the 80s, when he was a convener, he was a very left-wing convener in a car factory. All through that time, they got the best wages, the best working conditions in industry, essentially. But they never, ever once through that whole period of time ever thought about what they were making. The fact they were making motor cars in his sense. And I found that quite astounding, that someone could, he was almost reflecting on the fact that his whole life as a sort of activist trade unionist had kind of, in one sense, come to nothing. They never even thought about this question, what they produced. And he was completely bowled over by coming across the Lucas project now, late on in 2016. And the fact that those workers had really thought about that, and they really connected up to the concerns about the present, about the environment, and they did it at that time. But it's quite interesting to think about actually what that means in terms of, I thought about afterwards and thought, well, actually, in a sense, what he was saying was that in a sense, what they were doing by being such good trade unionists and activists, they were in a certain sense carrying out what Fordism and Ford tried to do. And that was to have an idea where you had you know, a production line going, workers that were paid, and they were paid, you know, over the hours, they were paid quite well, because then they could consume the products. It was almost like a perfect capitalist setup, yeah. And it made me think about that, because I thought I was involved in a film group in the 1970s, and we'd made a lot of films. We made films with the Upper Clyde ship workers, dockers, miners, all kinds of people. And we were around and making films at the time of the Lucas, but we never made a film with the Lucas people. And we knew about the Lucas project, but we didn't make a film about it. And so I was kind of, I found myself sort of asking the question, well, why have we never made a Lucas film? And why is it, in a certain sense, that what we've done is generally reacted to events? We sort of, you know, the reacted to, you know, the Industrial Relations Act comes out, so workers sort of engage in activity around it, and we make a film about it, about the solidarity, about the negative effects of the Industrial Relations Act on workers, etc. But it was very much about reacting to things, and it never really considered this whole question of what, you know, the way the Lucas people were thought about actually being more proactive and thinking about what they, you know, going on, being proactive and coming forward with proposals of what you might make, rather than simply reacting to things. So you end up, for instance, with things like films being made, like, for instance, Cinemaction's Miners film doesn't once mention anything about the environment, coal and the environment. Or a film like, a lot of you might have seen a film like Roger and Me, for instance. Roger and Me doesn't mention anything about motor car production. So the first question I had when starting to make this film was, why had there never been a film made about Lucas? And partially I came to a sort of early conclusion about the fact that, you know, it wasn't a very dramatic story. There was no police violence. You know, a lot of critical films have got, you know, this street fighting the police, there's action going on. It's all kind of, you know, dramatic stuff. And in a certain sense, the Lucas people were sort of looked upon, I think, at the time, even by the left, as being sort of almost like too reformist, not revolutionary enough. It wasn't, you know, really out there kind of fighting for you know, it wasn't a kind of revolutionary activity. It was kind of seemed to be a bit reformist, yeah. But I thought, if we jump forward now, of course, 40 years later, time tells us something differently. And actually now I understood them, and people started to understand them, I think, at that more recent history, as being the pioneers that they were. And that is what led me to sort of want to make this film about their story. And it sort of, and I started to sort of make this film in the context, 2014, I started to research it, and I started to research both finding Lucas workers and also the archive film, etc. And you got to remember, this was all before, you know, before Corbyn was on the ballot, before, you know, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, before any of those things. It was in the land of Miliband and the sort of Tory light policy of the Labour Party. And the reason I wanted to make the film at that point was precisely to sort of try and bring back the sort of Lucas approach to things, to sort of reflect on why is that all those ideas been lost? What was it in sort of the whole neoliberal movement, and then the way in which Labour had prefigured that and also followed it, in, you know, with Blairism, etc. There had completely meant that we lost sight of that kind of activity. And so I wanted to make something that would try to put Lucas, that whole Lucas film, back on the political map, if you like. And I just sought to make the best film I could, which really told the whole story. And that's what the 3-hour film tries to do. And so it's really not just about it's not just about the, you know, the products that they came up with, because they were pioneering products in their day, but a lot of those products now exist. But it was about the sort of the process of what they did. And the most important thing I learned, I think, in making this film and working with the Lucas workers was precisely this idea, which I've tried to talk about badly before, about this idea of reacting. That they kind of, their whole way of working was to move away from just reacting constantly to, in their case, decisions by their company financial decisions meant workers going to be made redundant, etc. Factories were going to close, they were going to lose jobs. But actually, rather than just constantly reacting to the company, but to start to develop a way where they could become proactive and they could become the sort of leaders of events rather than the tailing events. Yeah. And in a certain sense, that's the big thing, I think, for me, as to what they did. They just turned everything on its head. Yeah. And I think it's something that we can learn very much from politically, very much from, in terms of how we can think of working, how we need to think of working now. And I just want to talk a little bit, because in the short film, there's no mention of it. And certainly in the longer film, there's very little mention of these things I'm going to just briefly talk about now, because it seems very important to me that the Lucas workers often would say to me, without the Lucas Combine, that was their Combine organization, which was an organization of workers across 17 factories, across 11 different trade unions. Without that organization, there would have never been a Lucas plan. And that organization that they built, this workers' combine, which spread across all these factories and all these different unions, was very much, it started by running campaigns around pensions, whereby what they did, and one of the important things about the kind of campaigns they led was to bring a sort of some more democratic and egalitarianism into their organization. So that the campaign around pensions is very much also about a sort of leveling up of pension rights across, whether it's the higher paid workers or lower paid workers. So they ran campaigns around pensions, about health and safety and things like this. They had their own newspaper, and they'd run a whole series of campaigns then around redundancies. And their organization as well, this combine, was a very democratic setup. They were very, very important, they felt, to have something that was very democratic. So for instance, the smaller factories had as much voting rights as the larger ones, so that they couldn't be minoritized, as it were. And they developed a whole set of these campaigns, and also a sense that they very much researched what they were doing. So all their health and safety work was based on researching with people to find out about different effects that certain of the things they were using in their factory, that their health effects had on people. The pensions thing, the same. They had one of the people in their organization was very well up on pensions and knew a lot about pensions, and so he enabled them to work effectively around that question. Structural unemployment, the same. They did an awful lot of work on that. And then later on, when they started to work on with the alternative products, and with academics in university, and got research into the whole nature of state finance and funding. Sorry, I've got to turn this off. And things like the whole cost, the way the state funds industry and funds research and development, and was funding their company to do arms manufacture. And their logic then was, well, actually, if you're funding or putting all that money, like they are nowadays, into certain things, putting all this money into the arms industry, it could just as well be put into socially useful products. And also researching things like the cost to the taxpayer of putting people on the dole rather than keeping people in work. So the whole way in which they work was to sort of find way they came up with, eventually with the Lucas plan, but preceding it with a whole set of other activities which had developed a democratic organization and developed a whole way of working around a whole set of products, which was very proactive rather than waiting for things to happen, but looking ahead and being proactive. And I think this is the most important thing I think I take from their whole way of working. I think it's quite interesting looking at now. I was just looking the other day at a group where I come from, Coventry. There's a group of people who were organising, and they're sort of been very interested in Lucas plan. I've talked with them quite a bit about it and worked on the film with them about it. And they're developing a whole way in which they're developing a whole sort of sense in which they're trying to develop within Coventry an alternative, how you might think about developing a locally based alternative plan. And this comes out of a context where they were sort of the local council very much is sort of into sort of, I've got some notes on this, which I'm interested to refer to them. Yeah, the local council is a Labour council, and it's very much interested in, a kind of business as usual approach, unfortunately. So it's their idea in terms of investment for the future is to sort of build a sort of develop a station complex, the kind of complexes you've seen. Birmingham, for instance, there's a massive one over its rail station, where you've got them shopping and stuff, etc., etc. And to link into the HS2, that sort of investment strategy, and also a thing where they've discovered that they're going to put 1.6 billion of taxpayers' money into funding a luxury hotel as part of this development. So they sort of, local Labour councils very much fixed on this sort of traditional trickle down economics approach. The Lucas, people interested in the Lucas plan, Coventry for a Green New Deal group are trying to develop an alternative strategy, which is, and they held a whole set of workshops around thinking about how they could think about decarbonising the economy, a different industrial strategy, with councillors, activists, trade unions, and local people coming up with proposals as to how they can develop the idea of a green transformation. How can they look across transport, social justice, education? They've got all these various sectors that they're looking at, and they're setting up working groups. And the idea is to sort of map out the whole sort of town and what needs to be looked at. And also within that, to look at what's already been done by local action groups and organizations. And it seems to me that kind of activity is the kind of activity which is reminiscent or comes out of the sort of Lucas plan approach. So, I mean, I've talked off the film in a sense, but I think it's important that, as the person gave in the introduction, we're sitting today in this COVID world, which is very much unhinged the sort of political map that we have. You've got a Tory government sort of announcing that they've nationalised the economy. You've got the idea that, who really matters in the economy, the workers and the carers who actually really matter. There's much more consciousness of that. You've got aspects of conversion taking place, factories being converted from one thing to another, which you've seen, in wartime in the past, is happening in places. And I think the big question for us clearly now, which the opening person who introduced touched on, was how we exit, I suppose, how we exit the current situation. And with the climate emergency being obviously the big question, how do we create the fact that the climate emergency needs the same kind of things happening as are happening in relation to the COVID thing? How are we going to avoid going back into business as usual? And clearly, it seems to me the only way that's going to happen is if there is more activity of the type, Lucas plan type, of the type of thing that's being talked about here in Coventry. There must be lots of other areas where this is already happening. But these kind of activity as the building blocks to actually, start to build an alternative strategy and an alternative way out of the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. It was a little more than 10 minutes, but I did say you can go well over. No, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. Brilliant. I think that leads us quite nicely into the 30-minute version of your film, which I hope that Kevin will be able to press the button and on we go. Brilliant. You can minimize the video, the thumbnails, to maximize the screen.
When you're looking for a job, you're looking for a job. You don't make choices. Some people do. Some very principled people make a decision not to work in the arms industry. But you go to a company because you're going to get paid and you're going to feed your wife and kids and whatever.
But then when you get settled in, you get more confident. You then entitled to say, well, why am I doing this?
This is a story about when these workers' livelihoods were threatened, and they came up with an alternative plan.
They expressed their great anxiety about the future of their company and the prospects for employment. And I said to them, well, look, why don't you go away and do a corporate strategy for your own company based on your own knowledge of the company, of the equipment, of the skills, of the market available? And they did. And it's one of the most remarkable exercises that's ever occurred in British industrial history.
We took the view that it was no good just waiting until the problems were on us and then whining to the government or to the TUC or whoever that we want the right to work. We thought that we have a very highly skilled, very competent workforce, and we have the intelligence amongst ourselves to devise or endeavour to solve the problems for ourselves.
Because it's a very small step to go from power generators on aircraft to wind turbines.
A plan that's even more pertinent today.
And you'll see things in there, cheap, efficient heating systems, propulsion units, such as hybrid engines for motor vehicles, that uses the best characteristics of both the petrol and electric engines. Power generating equipment. Lucas Aerospace, a core business almost, was power generation gas turbines to provide the electricity for aircraft. So in the plan, there is a proposal for wind turbines. An example of a product that came up from, actually wasn't one of our members, it wasn't a union member in our office. He said, I'm against more or less everything that you do, Phil. He said, but I really support this. He'd worked on heat pumps and that kind of technology for a long time, and we actually developed a prototype heat pump powered by natural gas.
What the corporate plan was saying, you make socially useful products, and when we look at cutting back on defence, what could you do with the skills that you've got, with the capital that you've got? What could you make if you weren't making that?
If that had been spent on mass transit, heating system, solar power, wind generation, all of those sectors would provide more jobs.
And it all happened 40 years ago. 150 alternative products developed from the shop floor for a more sustainable world.
These ideas are around, it's just a question of bringing them together, of developing them into something that will really work. We had 4 or 5 of the more technically minded people actually sorting out, will this work, will it not? People who actually design parts for aircraft that keeps aircraft in the air. So they weren't airy-fairy, I mean, they knew what they were doing. But it had tapped into the workforce, and if you've got people who had ideas, they wanted their ideas to be known as well.
And that was when the whole notion of the political climate we were in was writ larger, because the government were the main customer of Lucas Aerospace, but somehow there was a political definition of profit at work, that it was profitable to make arms paid for by taxpayers' money, but not profitable to make life-saving equipment paid for by taxpayers' money. So there's a pure political definition of profit taking place there. I think what I saw, along with my colleagues around me, was the world around us was not right. The technology was not being used in the interests of ordinary working people. The control of technology and where the money is put into scientific research. It's okay to pour tens of millions of pounds, if not billions, into researching and developing and improving, say, a fighter's manoeuvrability by 2%. That's okay, and that always used to be done on a cost-plus contract, so the company could charge you what they want. But, it's not profitable to keep an extra 3,000 people a year alive for want of kidney machines. 3,000 people were dying each year for want of a kidney dialysis machine.
And Lucas already made this particular product, but they were reducing the numbers they were making, and there was, at the same time, there was more of a need. You're a worker as well as being part of the community. I mean, that's the two things. You can't just see yourself as a worker. Okay, you're going there to get yourself a living, but also you take into account you live in a wider society. Your neighbour's probably got a problem with the kidneys or whatever, so there's a connection there. And you see the various things that are going on. You see about the environment, about the fact that we're running out of oil, and it was we had to look at other forms of motivating cars. So you just haven't got this sort of set mind of a worker, but you also, once you get to a position where you're saying, well, we haven't got enough. They say we haven't got enough work doing this. They wasn't getting the aerospace work. Then I think automatically, if you're going to talk about other products, you're going to talk about something useful because you're a person, you're a human, you're affected by it all.
And whilst we were looking at the corporate plan in terms of preserving our jobs, we were looking at society in a broader sense. We wanted to broaden it out. And in many respects, it broadened itself out. It took us on paths. Energy. The main areas in energy was conservation of energy and the storage of energy, particularly in housing. To develop designs in building houses that were energy efficient, run in conjunction with the ideas that we had about developing systems with local authorities to support people with design input in building their own houses and building in these energy conservation systems. Then ordinary people who were unemployed could then be put to work building their own house, and it would be designed in such a way as to be energy efficient, both in terms of conserving the energy in the house and maintaining and collecting energy that would be for their use and their community's use.
Let me know when you gather. What's you?
Light them all up.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger. Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
We just engaged all 8 individuals.
We're in a period where oil prices had quadrupled. It was just after yet another conflict in the Middle East. So again, the political backdrop to the construction of the plan meant you couldn't actually do anything without thinking of the energy consequences of it. So the conservation of energy in the production process, and then that whole notion of built-in obsolescence, which was a wastage of energy, and Lucas Motors were a past master of that because they were designing motor car components for obsolescence. Design meeting at Great King Street that Mike used to talk about, where the secondary market for spare windscreen wiper motors was flagging because they were lasting too long. So they reduced the bearing area by 30%, so the windscreen wiper motors would wear out quicker, so they'd sell more on the spares market. And the cost to the planet in raw materials of that built-in obsolescence type manufacture, which is still with us, isn't it? That things don't last, so they end up on the tip. So you have to mine more scarce materials, you have to fight and wage war over who controls the raw materials. And there was the proposal to try and stop design for built-in obsolescence, and therefore things should be made in a fashion where they could be repaired, and the skills then for repairing cars, washing machines, dishwashers could be taught to perhaps younger people as a means of giving them a skill set, the awareness of energy and repair rather than design for built-in obsolescence.
Young people searching for spare parts on this waste-dumping Ghana wasn't exactly what Phil had in mind. All this no doubt a profitable way to meet EU recycling targets. One of the largest poisonous waste dumps for throwaway Western goods. Small change to what can be made on the grander world dumping grounds.
In the division where I worked, the engine management division, Lucas, they wanted just to concentrate on aerospace products and didn't really get involved in industrial applications of gas turbines. And some of these gas turbines, I think it was a GG220, was particularly suitable for combined heat and power systems within communities, so that you could have the system, you know, again under the head of energy conservation, using a gas turbine generator. It would provide heat and power for a local community.
Is it a town, is it a city, or is it just an housing estate? You determine the community, then you look at the size of the power plant that you need to do that. The gas turbine, develop the gas turbines, they will give you power, that's your electricity, they will give you your heating, and it will be all in one system. And all you'd need is the switching gear in each house to control the input into the house from that source. And then you can feed it off to the grid, what's left of it. But it's a community thing. The community have to be involved, they have to discuss it, they have to know what's going on, know how to work it and know how to control it. I mean, you've got to remember that all the systems of sewerage, etc., all goes back to local authorities. I mean, it's not big business that starts these, it's local authorities. Like towns like Birmingham in the 19th century. So we're going back to that in a sense. It's, dare I use the phrase, back to the future sort of thing, that people controlling their own environments, controlling their own energy inputs and outputs, and paying for it, which they do, whether it's big business running it or they're running it for their own use. But the profits, if there are any, are for the community. They're not for whoever, some French-owned outfit that owns the power supply system. It's democratising power supply, if you want.
I mean, I don't think it's just a question of deprivatising the companies. I think they've got to go one step further than that, not just back to the old electricity boards, but to do something back in the communities where it all started from in the first place.
I mean, if you think about the involvement of a community, setting up those systems, which diminishes the influence of the multinational power companies, and it makes them independent of them. So they all have to be involved in the decisions. They all have to be involved in how the system works. They're creating jobs in their own particular economy. And as a consequence of that, this is only one example of how civil society is being used for its own ends. for its, and in the end of the day, I suppose, for its own profit in that sense, if you want to use that term. So it's not just the power supply itself, it's the effect it has on society. I mean, you're taking on the big builders and all the rest of it. I mean, you come up with an idea where 1 million unemployed people can start building houses which are energy efficient and save on the costs. I mean, the building industry's not going to look on that with great, you know, they're not going to have great enthusiasm for it. You'd need government support, finance, local authority support, finance, but the big builders get that anyway. They get government support, they get local authority support, and the housing prices go through the roof, and working people can't afford them. We were saying protect society and develop society in a fair and equitable way. I mean, the system tries to say that that's you, that's them, nothing to do with one another, but we are a society, and if we're going to look at work, and we're going to look at energy, and we're going to look at efficiency, then we have to look at society as a whole. And that's what we're about. That's what Lucas Aerospace was about. Not Lucas Aerospace, but Lucas Aerospace Joint Shop Stewards were about.
After we'd presented it to Lucas Aerospace directors, they refused to meet us ever again, rejecting the whole thing lock, stock and barrel, including hybrid power pack technology for cars and including wind turbines. The term that management used to discredit that particular proposal for wind turbines was it's in the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade, and we're aerospace.
In the electronics department, every time we met the management, they made it clear that they weren't interested in any alternatives. They were just upgrading the electronics on the aircraft side, and they saw that as the future, and they didn't want to know about anything else.
After the management rejected the corporate plan, The combine felt it was necessary to demonstrate that 2 or 3 of the products that we could afford to build from our meagre combine and supporter resources could actually be translated into products, socially useful products, that would have technical feasibility. So with the assistance of the North East London Polytechnic, funding was obtained from, I think it was Rowntrees, which helped develop a hybrid power pack for a Hillman motor car. And so they basically transplanted an electric drive system onto a Hillman imp and a control system to demonstrate the viability of a hybrid drive.
Then I heard that Cadbury Trust could make £60,000 available if we could set up a centre in the Midlands area. I had that discussion with the University of Warwick. They went to the Senate to discuss the idea of us having a unit there. There's a business school there, but they got very clear links with Lucas, and obviously they were frightened off. £60,000 worth of money was, you know, it had funded something for 3 years in those days. It was a good thing. There were people there who wanted to respond to those sorts of initiatives and welcomed it. But the bureaucracy or the management were very hesitant. It was interesting to see what you were dealing with and how they resisted it. And in the end, we got this agreement with the Polytechnic in Coventry, and that set up the Unit for Development of Alternative Products.
And quite early on in the project, there was an electric car that was running around, well, an electric vehicle, a small truck actually, that was running around in Coventry, you know, in the early 70s.
And then the Open University, along with ourselves, had a chat, and we got a project going, and we actually developed a prototype gas-powered heat pump powered by natural gas. Hitherto, they've been powered by electricity, which wasn't the most thermal efficient way of doing it. And we actually built, they actually built a gas-powered heat pump. And Sheffield City Council became very interested in gas-powered heat pumps, and that interaction partly led to the inclusion of the concept of social use production in the Labour group's manifesto.
The latest government report suggests that this is one of the major means of conserving energy. The company is still saying that that is not a viable product, but we have intercepted one of the company's own market surveys, which shows that the market for these in the domestic sector by 1985 will be 255 million, so nobody can seriously suggest that that's not viable.
Can a multinational solve the problem of where we're going with the environment? They don't even ask the question. They don't say, where's our products and our systems taking the environment? It's just, will this make us a profit? And if it will make a profit, then it's made. If we can't get the toxic emissions down, let's tell lies about it. And I don't think Volkswagen are on their own there. I mean, this is part of the pressure that comes on to a management. It happens in most industries. But if you look at what's happening in the third world, I mean, it's really horrendous. And the only way it's going to happen is by new ways of approaching society and the way involving society in the way things happen, as we've said in the products that we've mentioned.
Here was a group of shop stewards really advancing the argument for sustainability in the 70s, and management dismissing it, and the cost to the planet shows the lack of responsibility the management displayed.
I I think by its very nature, they couldn't solve the problem, even if they wanted to, even if they decided, you know, tomorrow I want to make the world a better place, because they would find that they would lose their competitive edge against other companies and other countries, and therefore it you know, they are trapped almost in having to do what their shareholders, if you like, are demanding of them, because they are as vulnerable as anybody else in the capitalist system. So it wasn't about the individuals, it was about the system which operates in that particular way. Isn't a brave new world now?
If we don't move now, and move very, very quickly, both large and small companies alike, I think we run a major risk of losing competitiveness.
We still have time to stay in this race if we run very hard now.
It was a philosophical view of the world, and the mentality of there's only one way. And all we were doing at Lucas Aerospace was saying there are alternatives to what you're being told. All you've got to do is open your eyes and look at them. That can't be legislated for hook, line and sinker. Legislation can only be put in place that supports society, where at the moment legislation supports big business, supports the city, supports banks. The fact is they spend billions and billions and billions, does state governments, which they pour into private companies. That's okay, right? But if you want to put a few 100,000 or a few million into social use of product, no, that's the market. I think we were very challenging to the system, workers telling them what they should be making. And if you think you can do that with the entrenched power structures you're up against, we are not naive. What we wanted to do was say, well, we'll go past management right down to shop floor and then it'll go up. Obviously, you know, you're turning the world on its head. It's absolutely turning the world on its head.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve, for that. That's enticing me into 3 hours I haven't got tonight, but I'll hopefully be able to watch it sometime soon. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope everyone enjoyed that. Certainly a group of people that were ahead of their times, and shame that they didn't get a chance to implement that. But we've got to do that now. I was interesting that transferable technology. We've got all the skills here. We've got all the technologies here. It is just about making them do the things that we actually need. And just now I noticed, you know, during this current COVID-19 crisis, gin makers switching to making hand sanitizers. I think both are needed during this crisis, but you know, the hand sanitizers are in a little bit more short supply. and a lot of the small scale engineering companies are switching to making PPE at incredibly short notice and turning it out for the benefit, because that's actually what we need. I particularly enjoyed the reference to brown bread and sandals brigade, and I'm luckily you can't see what I'm wearing on my feet, but yeah, I was certainly one of the brown bread and sandals brigade in the early 80s, not as advanced as these people, in the early 80s. So yeah, a great reference, but that's what we need to do now. I think we're going to move on. The next stage is we're going to have a debate on climate change and social justice. And we've got a panel of people here. And I think I've got 4 of the panel here. I've got Elfried, Martin Lines. I think you're here, Martin. That's Elfried Bramley-Crawshaw, Martin Lines, Kevin Wingfield, and Steve, yourself. We've also a statement from Silvana Birchenough from CFAS, which I think Kevin will read. Is Mark Harrison or Mike Smith-Clare, are they here? If you can you unmute and say hello?
Can I just come in?
Come in, Richard, yes.
Yeah, Mark Smith-Clare's got a statement. He can't be here, to be honest.
Okay, have you got a statement? Will you read that statement?
It's only a small statement, though, to be honest.
Yeah, brilliant.
All right.
Okay. What I thought, if it's okay with everyone, I'll introduce people very briefly. I'm giving them each 10 minutes to talk to us. So there's 4 people plus a couple of statements, and then we'll be open for questions and answers. If you do want to, at the end of it, if you do want to ask a question, if you could put your virtual hand up or your physical hand up. Probably best if you do the hands up on the screen, because I can more easily see everyone's hand on that. There's a little button that you press to raise your hand. But if you put your hand up like that, I will endeavour to see it. So I'm going to kick off. I hope Elfried is here. She is. I can see her. I'm going to kick off with Elfried Bramley-Crawshaw. She is well, she'll explain what she is, but she's a councillor in Beccles alongside me, but has many other hats on as well. So Elfried, I'll give you 10 minutes or so to talk to us all.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me, Graham?
I can
see
indeed,
me? Can
yes.
you hear me? Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. Well, I'll just reiterate Graham's point from earlier that it's very odd to all be doing this at home, but thanks to those who have enabled this to happen today, because it's really worthwhile. Well, as Graham said, I'm Elfried Bramley-Crawshaw. I have a long and difficult to say name, which is a blessing and a curse sometimes, but at least everyone knows who I am. I'm a Green councillor for the district and county for Beccles Division, which includes Worlingham, North Cove and Barnby. I live in Beccles with my husband and 2 children who are 10 and 13. And I'm passionate about raising the issue of the climate emergency and creating a more equal society. And I happen to think that these 2 issues go hand in hand and we can't resolve one without the other. And in many ways, we shouldn't resolve one without the other. It's fortunate having 2 younger children at the moment. The younger generation are particularly motivated to sort out the issue of the climate emergency because, of course, it threatens their future most of all. So in my household, I am most definitely held to account by both of them, and I definitely value that. This current crisis that we're all living through has shone a spotlight on the level of inequality in our country and indeed around the whole world. This has been particularly apparent for those of us working as volunteers in our communities on the front line to try and get people what they need. In fact, it's been emotional and difficult understanding how people are forced to live now and have been forced to live in recent years. Graham and myself and Caroline and Mark, who are councillors in Beccles, have set up a phone line, and we've been taking calls from people in the community on an 0300 number. And every day we're hearing the challenges that people are faced with. Just this morning, I had a phone call from a 40-year-old man. And when I told him that we could get him food within 20 minutes, he actually wept down the phone. This is almost unbearable. It's particularly unbearable for me because I know that as a community, we have plenty of food. There is no reason for anyone to be going hungry. So it's merely an issue of allocating resources to people. We have enough for everyone. And that's why we need to press forward and demand that everyone has what they need. There is no need for a 40-year-old man to be weeping down the phone to his counsellor because of his own gratitude in that moment. He doesn't need to feel grateful for having his basic needs met. We live on a planet with finite resources, yet we have a growth economy system. It should be simple in everyone's mind that this is not a way to resolve our situation of inequality. If we continue along the same trajectory of a growth economy, we will destroy the planet and we will destroy ourselves in a very painful way. So we all need to take a moment to reflect and have a plan for the future that provides for everyone. It's so important that when we emerge from this crisis, we don't go back to business as usual. Our people are hurting, our planet is hurting, and it feels like the right moment to mention the link between the climate emergency and the increased likelihood of pandemic. For all these reasons, we must really strive to end the myth that there is a conflict between a healthy, thriving economy and the green agenda. Now, I've used the term green agenda deliberately because that's the way it's described when people stand up for the environment and for the health of the planet and the people that live on it. This narrative is used by people who profit from a neoliberal economic model to argue against the change we need for an environmentally sustainable future. At this point, it would really make sense to make reference to the wonderful film we've just watched. And I'm always particularly struck by this designing for obsolescence. It's this complete madness to be creating things which are designed to fail so that then they have to be replaced. And we know that's a particular problem at the moment. And then we have to make more of them. And then when these things can't be fixed or repaired, we can't even take the materials from them and reuse them. In fact, in Suffolk, these materials are burnt in a giant incinerator and are essentially lost forever, these precious materials that are already rare and sparse. So as humankind, we need to take a really good, long, hard look at ourselves and think about the future we want, indeed having a future at all. I believe that a good future would be living on a flourishing planet and all the wonders that brings with it, where everyone lives good and healthy lives, with good quality, sustainable jobs for everyone, no 0 hours contracts, where people can provide for themselves and live with genuine dignity. And for those that can't work, we should make proper provision for those people. Nobody should be living in poverty. We have enough for everyone. We can offer everyone a good lifestyle. I really hope that this meeting today can be part of that really constructive dialogue, and together we can stand up against the myth that says we need a growth economy, and we can argue for something else, something better, something where we can live together, meeting people's needs and live exciting lives.
Thank you, Elfried. Sorry, I was a little bit slow on my mute button there, but I am getting the hang of this. This is the Zoom technology, the modern technology. Brilliant. That was really good. I think you're absolutely right about the two crises being solved. They're hand in hand. They are integrally linked. And I'm not talking about the COVID-19 crisis. That's not one of them. That's a temporary thing that we're dealing with. Next on my list is Martin Lyons. I hope you're with us, Martin. You were a few seconds ago.
Yeah.
Martin is a farmer from the Nature Friendly Farming Network. And what a fantastic backdrop. Is that real? Is that borage behind you?
Phacelia and beans is one of my flower enhanced margins.
Brilliant. Looks fantastic. Great for wildlife. I'll let you talk about your vision. Over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I'm actually going to share my screen, and if it won't let me share. Okay, I can't share that. That's right, I was going to share my screen. So I am an arable farmer from Cambridgeshire. We also deliver, we also have a climate crisis, we also have a biodiversity crisis and a food supply crisis. There's plenty of food, but as we've seen through this COVID crisis, there's a supply chain problem. We've got the wrong food in the wrong place and unable for the public to be able to easily consume it. So then I chair this network of nature-friendly farmers who set up 2.5 years ago, because there's many farmers who want to tackle and want to enhance biodiversity and nature on their farms at the same time as delivering healthy quality products. So on my farm, we can use a lot of data, technology, and GPS to understand inputs and outputs. And that allows us to spare bits of land around the outside that doesn't fit modern machinery or aren't so productive for producing crops. That allows me to have areas so I can deliver biodiversity. So as you see from my picture, across the farm, we have additional resources for biodiversity, for pollinators, for insects. By having this diversity, we increase our population of beneficiaries, increase my yield from pollinators. I have predatory insects, so I can decrease the herbicides and insecticides I need to use. And we can deliver this tapestry across the landscape for biodiversity, which helps us make healthier food and a healthier landscape. And without this tackling of this crisis, we're actually going to have a production system where we see our soils depleted, our environmental depleted, and actually our future food supply really being challenged. There's some huge opportunities coming up with this government in the agriculture bill and environmental bills. They're about moving money from paying farmers just to farm towards public money for public goods, and actually supporting the delivery of the right options in the right place for flood mitigation, climate enhancement, and various other things. And then give us a fair marketplace to produce food to and get a fair reward. Rather than just paying farmers money, and we see many farmers just want additional support all the time when the markets collapse. We have a system where the markets don't work technically for farmers, or we have a landscape that's declining to work for the society. And we can actually tackle all this as we go forward. We need to think about how we use our landscape, how we use our environment. On our farm, we've brought livestock back into the system as an arable farm. It's so important to have the right livestock in the right place, but we shouldn't be producing lots of food and maize and soya to feed livestock. We should be feeding them the grasses and the natural growth. By having that fertilizer in my soil, it gives me healthier crops. One of the other measures we've been bringing in on our farm, and many others do, is recycled green waste. And unfortunately, I can't show you the picture of it, but my local green recycling waste plant that brings in several thousand tons of green waste every week is full of plastic. People are not recycling the product very well. So when I'm receiving it as a compost and applying it to fields, it's full of microplastics. We need to make the whole system responsible for itself and circular. So any waste that instead of being incinerated or dumped in a landfill, we can bring it back and reuse it and fertilize the soil or reuse those products in different ways. So we need to actually get the society to step up and recognize the harm it's doing in the waste processes it's doing, and just discarding products when they have additional life. We need society and governments to stand up and buy from the decent places and farmers that are delivering the right products from the right landscape. We have a system where we drive our standards up in the UK, but then we import without conscience of the environmental impact our products have around the rest of the world. And we should actually deliver what we say here and around the world. We have a huge opportunity, and farming can have a really positive role in engaging in making a life better for us all, including better public access, flood mitigation, climate mitigation, and various other things. So the network is for farmers, for members of the public, and for organisations. It's free to join because we want to stand together across the UK with a strong voice to say there is a different way. We shouldn't be farming every bit and farming to the best output and farming for the best yield. We should be farming and deliver food for the people where we need it. And on that, I'll finish.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. That's great. I'm shame we couldn't see your screen, but we have got a lovely backdrop of Facilia, not Borage. I apologise for that. I was trying to be clever, I think, but failed miserably. Brilliant. We do actually. I mean, the biodiversity crisis you mentioned is really, really serious, and it's not just about different crops, you know, having a large variety of crops. It's about the biodiversity within a crop as well. And one of the things I've done during this crisis is I've switched to some different flour, some local flour, and it's you're probably familiar with it, the YQ flour from Wakelin's farm, and it's fantastic. It is much different to use. It's really different because it's low gluten. It's old varieties a lot of the time, but it's fantastic for the biodiversity of a crop. So I'm working on that really well. That's my challenge for this lockdown period, is to master baking with this flour. Tastes absolutely delicious though. Brilliant. Our next person on is Mark Harrison. I hope you're there, Mark. Mark is from, just confirm you are there, Mark, before I introduce you.
I'm here.
Brilliant, Mark. That's great. Yeah, Mark is, well, my notes say is Norfolk Against Universal Credit and Social Action Solutions. I hope that's you. That's a good description, but I'll give you 10 minutes to say a little bit more about yourself and about your vision for the future. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. I'm going to speak first of all about disabled people and then move on to universal credit, because I think in the climate crisis, one of the groups of people that get left behind are disabled people. And I'm a member of Reclaiming a Futures Alliance, which is an alliance of disabled people's organisations run by disabled people for disabled people, and Disabled People Against Cuts Norfolk. And that's partly why I was elected as chair of Norfolk Against Universal Credit, because Deepak Norfolk has taken a lead in campaigning against universal credit. But before I come on to that, I think it's really important that we have some understanding around disability and climate change, and how climate change disproportionately affects disabled people. So it doesn't matter whether it's powerful cyclones or extreme droughts or human-induced extreme weather events. This is what is going to become, and has become for many people across the globe, a daily experience. And climate change and emergencies will disproportionately affect disabled people due to the barriers that lead to disabled people's inequity and exclusion. And it's really important that we think about the disabled population and not just think about us, but also consider and actively involve us in the response to climate crisis and climate change risks. And it's really important how we think about how we conceptualize disability, because so often disabled people are left out. They're seen as objects, passive in the process, and objectified in the process. So there are some very important messages from the disability rights movement, and we are, you know, whether we're talking about workers' rights, trade union rights, or disability rights, they come from the same place. And there are some key messages around disability that I want to get over. First of all, nothing about us without us is the slogan of the disability movement. the disability rights movement. This means that if we're talking about disability, disabled people have to be in the lead in those discussions, and that there should be no discussion about us without us. And the second message, which comes from the disability movement in Mexico, because so often those ideas were colonized by the disability charities and the professionals who make their living from disability, and they're saying to reclaim the power was professionals should be on tap, not on top. And that's a really nice image where disabled people have control of the tap and they can turn it on and they can turn it off. That's not to deny other people's expertise, but that disabled people should control it. The next thing we need to understand and challenge are the traditional notions of disability and around disabled people. And disabled people had to develop their own ideas around the social model of disability because, and it was very clear, the dominant view of disabled people and traditional thinking was very much a medical model or a deficit model. And that was seeing disabled people as somehow deficient or damaged, that there was some ideal human being and disabled people deviated from that ideal. So, and the traditional, ideas around disability was what's wrong with you? And disabled people challenged that, like the women's movement did and the Black liberation movements did around, colonialist and superior notions around how people defined us as a group. So the social model was defined, which was saying disability has nothing to do with us. It's nothing to do with us and our impairments. Disability is about the barriers created in society. And I say that because it's very important around how we think about disability will lead to how policies are developed and how we're treated in society. And that's really particularly in terms of the current COVID crisis or climate change. Disabled people are often called a vulnerable group. And I want to challenge this notion that disabled people are a vulnerable group, because vulnerability isn't anything to do with us if we're looking at it through a social model lens. Vulnerability is created by society. So disabled people are made vulnerable by capitalist society that stick us to the margins, create barriers, exclude us, and discriminate against us. And that leads to outcomes where we have shorter lives, we don't get proper education, and we're discriminated against in the labour market. So we don't have the jobs and therefore we're poorer. So it's really important that we're not seen as vulnerable, because if we're seen as vulnerable, we're seen as the other, we're othered as a group, and that we're seen as passive objects, which takes away our voice, agency, and citizenship and our rights. So it's really important around when we think about climate change, what this means. And disabled populations will most likely have limited access to knowledge, resources and services to effectively respond to environmental change. And the classic example of this at the moment, where we seem to be the only country in the world where there's, at the daily briefings, there's no BSL sign interpreter for the deaf community. So the deaf community is completely left out by government and excluded from those briefings. And that's just a current example. Disabled people have to be included in the education system. And that means from infant, primary, secondary, right through to further and higher education. And we need to be included in the mainstream, not segregated education. And we must educate us and the wider community and the disability community on what to do if climate change, when it happens and how it happens. Exclusion from the health systems mean that disabled people are made vulnerable by extreme climate events, the ecosystem services loss and infectious diseases. And in a climate emergency, disabled people will be made more vulnerable or will be made vulnerable to contracting infectious diseases because of unequal access and barriers to accessing health, which don't enable disabled people to independently access water and sanitation. So a very good example of that was in Hurricane Katrina, in the response post Hurricane Katrina, where disabled people were disproportionately impacted from the effects of that natural disaster. In a climate emergency, if you're immobile because of impairment or an underlying health condition, you are more prone to get an infectious waterborne disease. But even in non-extreme events like air pollution, our health can be compromised in the long term. And disabled people are more likely to have difficulties during evacuations and migrations. With extreme weather events and disasters set to increase due to climate change, more needs to be done to plan and protect disabled people. And exclusion in disasters and emergencies tend to increase the exclusion of disabled people's organisations, where we're marginalised further. And this happened in, we studied the response to the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and disabled people were excluded at every level of the response to that, from the charities that set up emergency camps, from the food for work programs, from the water access and the latrines. They were all inaccessible, and disabled people's organisations couldn't get any funding. All the funding went to the non-disabled led charities, and the charities were excluding disabled people even from their meetings because they met in an inaccessible hotel where wheelchair users couldn't even get into the meetings. Disabled people have been prominent in exclusion, in the Exclusion Rebellion protests and actions. And there was established an XR Disabled Rebels group, which had initially to fight for recognition and access, and for the process to be made accessible. But once they were taken seriously, accessible toilets and hoists and changing tables were provided for disabled people to be involved. But before the action even took place and it started, the police confiscated all these accessible equipment that would have made people's involvement possible. We're excluded in a number of other ways. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change does work around and takes gender equality seriously. It has gender focal points. People who assist in gender-related decisions about the climate, but there isn't to date a list of disabled representatives. You know, this is something that's important, because the Paris Agreement makes clear its obligations to disabled people, disability and human rights. But when will disabled people actually be involved in the discussion and the decision making? Remember, nothing about us without us. Just to touch on universal credit, I think it's really important that we understand, and we've seen through COVID-19, that a benefit which discriminates against benefit claimants, reduces their level of existence and disproportionately affects disabled people, through COVID-19 is now affecting a much wider group of workers and trade unionists, and over 1.5, probably going up towards 2 million people now have had to apply for universal credit, and they'll get the shock of their lives, because they'll understand now just how excluded universal credit claimants have been over the past 3, 4, 5 years. You know, with the 5-week wait for payments, the loans that have to be paid back from a pitiful existence, you know, forcing people to live on £94 a week if they're a single person, or if they aren't eligible to claim universal credit, being stuck on £74.35 a week on job seekers allowance. So all of these pernicious policies that have been devised by the Tory government to set the unemployed, the reserve army of labour, against trade unionists, I think on May Day, it's really important that we think in terms of sustainability in relation to not just climate change, but the whole of society, and the film drew that out. We need to think about how this we conceptualize a new way of thinking, and one of the key challenges for that is removing conditionality from welfare benefits. That because of the crisis of capitalism and neoliberalism, vast areas of the country don't have any jobs, and after COVID-19 those jobs, many more, will have disappeared and never to come back. And it's really important because benefit sanctions, which are one of the most pernicious elements of universal credit, mean that if you don't comply with your work coach, if you don't spend up to 35 hours a week searching for jobs, in many areas non-existent jobs, then you can be sanctioned and lose all of your benefits. And those sanctions are pernicious. Claimants under universal credit are treated worse than people in the criminal justice system. If you're convicted in the criminal justice system of an offence in court, your income is taken into account in terms of how much you pay back per week. If you're sanctioned by the DWP, they sanction you and take away your benefits, and they can be taken away for up to 2 years. And this is really important. During COVID-19, sanctions have been suspended, and it's really important they never come back. We haven't got rid of the 5-week wait, and that's still to come. So from wearing my NAUC hat, I'm urging people to join Norfolk Against Universal Credit, or join Scrap Universal Credit Alliance if you're outside Norfolk. If you're in Suffolk or Essex or wherever, set up a local group or against universal credit. And if you look on the Scrap Universal Credit Alliance website, there's a guide to setting up new groups. And this is really important because it's now urgent, because as universal credit rolls out and becomes mainstream, it's going to affect more and more workers in the gig economy, in the lower paid economy, and people who are on so-called living wage, which is a maximum wage, which means that they have to claim working tax credits and child tax credits. You will be sucked into the vortex of universal credit. And it's really important that shop stewards, trade unionists, workplace representatives tool themselves up so that they can represent and support their members post COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I was just literally about to say a message last few minutes, but you beat me to it. That was extremely well timed. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting perspective on climate change. It's interesting. Climate change is a problem that some particularly influential people can protect themselves against to a certain degree, or can even benefit from. Whereas the COVID-19 crisis, at the moment, there is no real protection from it for anyone. And I think the speed of action and the depth of action that's being taken against the COVID-19 actually reflects that nobody can hide from it. Whereas in climate change, you think, oh, it'd be quite nice, climate change, or I can afford to go somewhere else, or whatever. So there is that protection there that that wealth can buy, but it can't. We need to deal with that. Thank you very much, Mark. I think the next person on would be Silvana Birchenough, but I think Richard is going to read a statement from her because she's unable to attend. So, Richard, are you able to join us with a statement?
Yes, I'll make a scene. Thank you very much for attending this debate, and it's a pity that Silvana hasn't been able to attend the meeting, but she is actually working at CFAS as a key worker. And so I asked her if she could provide a statement so that we have some kind of position from her. So this is what she has to say. The importance of understanding climate change effects. Thank you for the opportunity to cascade my message to you today. I wish you an interesting and successful debate. The world is clearly changing, and we need to ensure we take great care of the marine environment. I work at CFAS, and with our science, we try to continue to generate new evidence and understanding to protect our natural resources. Climate change and ocean acidification are both influenced by increasing carbon dioxide concentrations coming from the atmosphere. However, the distinction between ocean acidification and climate change is that ocean acidification is an alteration of the chemistry of seawater, therefore not a direct climate process. The ocean is the largest natural reservoir of dissolved carbon and holds an immense buffering capacity for changes in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. The rapid increase of atmospheric CO2 since the Industrial Revolution has caused oceans and seas to absorb increasingly amounts of CO2. This process disturbs the pre-existing chemical equilibrium of the sea, resulting in seas changing their chemical state and altering the ocean pH, becoming more acidic. Our understanding of changes affected by climate and ocean acidification have become some of the most studied topics in the last 10 years. In the UK, we have made significant contribution to understanding some of the climate-driven changes in diversity and biogeochemistry, and their sociological impacts across species and ecosystems. The evidence suggests that climate change effects will act differently across species, with some impacts already occurring for sensitive marine species and with direct and indirect repercussions for ecosystems. It is important that we continue with our science, discussions and bringing new evidence and action to safeguard the marine environment. This is our joint responsibility, and if we can continue to raise awareness and work together, then our efforts will help to safeguard the marine environment for current and future usage, enjoyment, and for our next generations. Stay safe and keep protecting our marine environment. Silvana Birchenough. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Silvana. That would have been it would have been really good to have her, particularly on the question and answer. A climate scientist would have been really useful. But although I think most of us hopefully know that the science well enough to be able to be informed on the subject. Richard, are you okay? I think you have a statement from Mike Smith-Clare as well.
I do have,
yep.
Yeah. So
I'm doing it in order of the program, so keep you on for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. This is Mike Smith-Clare. He's a Norfolk Borough Councillor and also Great Yarmouth Borough Councillor as well. And he just sent me a mail message today saying that it's apologies for not being able to attend. It's just a very short statement, really. I'm so sorry, but I won't be able to attend this afternoon. I'm running food around the county and the schedule has overrun due to an increase in need. These really are incredible, difficult times. Please extend my apologies and support. I've written a few words below which I would be grateful if you could share. I stand with those working towards ending the climate change crisis. We are a global community. We must face the undeniable fact that we can only address the problem by acting collectively. Our response must be strong, consistent, and supported by legislation and physical action. The future of this fragile world lies in all our hands. We must recognize that whether As workers or as consumers, change must come. We can and must adapt in order to ensure the greatest resource is there for generations to come. Together in solidarity, Mike Smith-Clare. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Mike, who was unable to be with us. I think we'd have struggled to squeeze all 7 in, actually, with full participation, but we've got a good selection of speakers. And last but no means least, because he is a co-host of this meeting, is Kevin Wingfield from the Socialist Worker Party. So I'm hoping that Kevin is ready to leap in, and I will take over any admin while he's speaking. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. I can, yes.
Good. Well, then I'll take you to be emblematic of everybody. I want to thank Richard and Waveney Trades Council for inviting me to speak here, and all the previous speakers who've spoken. And in particular, I really enjoyed and learned from both the short version of Steve's movie and indeed the long version, which we will stream tonight, and it'll be on the Waveney Festival sites, so it can be downloaded at your leisure to read, to enjoy and to learn from. The point I really want to make is, as I was introduced, I'm an eco-socialist. I'm part of an eco-socialist organization, the SWP, and for us and for everybody, I think, is the question of the climate crisis and indeed the corona crisis. They are linked, in my view. It is the large capitalist despoilation of wild areas and so on. I don't have time to go into all the details, but agribusiness, which has forced out of the wilderness new pathogens, which from time to time, from SARS and now COVID and others, are coming at us. The monster, as Mike Davis put it, is at the door. Mike Davis, the American eco-socialist who's writing on this, is absolutely stupendous. Okay, so what can we do about all of this? It seems to me that there's no shortage of ideas, and that's really what I find so inspiring about Steve Sprung's movie, is that ordinary working people have clear ideas about how their industries work and how they can possibly change them. And it seems to me that the question, therefore, is you see, I remember many years ago, I was a bus conductor on Dublin buses. There we are. I've had a spotty history. And there, the planners were trying to chisel away at costs. So they tried to force as many journeys as possible and so on in the most unrealistic timetables, but that's what they tried to force. But when you spoke to ordinary bus workers, every one of them knew how to organize a proper bus service, a bus service which, suited people properly. Now, that didn't come to be, and therefore we face problems. Now, the things that I want to move on very rapidly, therefore, to saying that the question, what this proves to us, the Lucas workers, the Dublin bus workers, the people up and down your street, if given the power, would have lots of ideas about how to organise society. Nobody down your street wants to see climate change. Nobody down your street wants to see this coronavirus dealt with by herd immunity, which means sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people. What they want to see is these things dealt with, and they have ideas. The difficulty is that the ideas that people have, the way that we could collectively change things so that they were operating in the interests of a sustainable environment, in the interests of masses of people, we don't have the power yet to do that. And it's my view that we need to have a great transformation of society from below. Those people, like the Lucas aerospace people of a generation ago, those people today in various industries and so on who understand how things could be done better, how things could be done environmentally sustainably. Those people need to be on board. We also need to have a what's the word now? A just transition. I remember when the coal industry was shut down. Well, coal's terrible for the environment. But that wasn't why the industries were closed down. They were closed down in order to break up a workforce that was well organised and prepared to defend its interests. And after their defeat, the close down operated enormously. The point of the matter was that all of those communities, those coal communities throughout the north of England and elsewhere, very frequently those coal villages are now derelict. The people there haven't got jobs, or they have to move away, or there's just Mickey Mouse jobs, all right? So the point was, how can people be on our side to do away with terrible industries and create better industries if they stand to lose? You have to have a just transition. You have to say, oh, there has to be retraining. Working people should not lose. I'm for not proceeding with Sizewell, and I'm for shutting down the existing Sizewell. But we need all the workers there to not be just thrown on the dole, but to be able to be re-employed, retrained into industries which are better for us. Okay, that's what we need to happen. Yeah, good idea. We've all got good ideas, haven't we? How do we make it happen? And I think one of the most important lessons of what's going on at the moment is we have to break the power of capital, because I thought it was lovely. Somebody in the film said, you know, can multinationals, you know, what could we make if we're not making that? And he was talking to the war materials and so on. So, and somebody else said on there immediately afterwards, can multinationals solve the climate emergency? And they answered the question. They said, their priority is profit. If they're not making sufficient profit, they go out of business. The people who are bosses cease to be bosses. And therefore there is a fierce discipline upon those people to be maximizing profit short term. Get that money in today, tomorrow. Who cares about the future? That is what capitalism is. It's about profit. Without the profits, without an acceptable rate of profit, the thing runs into the sand, and therefore the companies go bust and so on. They're trapped in that system. Again, a quote from somebody in the film. I think this is fantastically important, that insight. That it's not that governments have somehow or other had a wrong policy. It is that the policy of governments has been determined by the structure of the economy and those who are dominant within it, which is the rich and powerful. And they choose how governments can perform. Harold Wilson in his memoirs talked about how all his people, how when in '64 government, he was told he must, by the civil servants, that he couldn't put the manifesto into action because there'd be a run on the pound. There we are. And he said, look, I'm an elected government, and you're telling us I can't do what we were elected to do. And they said, yeah, that's right. There'll be a run on the pound. And indeed, there was a run on the pound. So really, then, we have to have a movement from below, a movement that's prepared to take action into its own hands, that's international in scope. I mean, the climate crisis is already with us. You talk to the people in the global south who are losing their livelihoods, who are trying desperately to get somewhere to survive, who are dying in the Mediterranean. You know, the climate crisis is with us already. It's not something for another day. And the COVID thing is part of that. We're facing enormous crisis. We must come out of this COVID crisis, if we ever do. We must come out of that much stronger and prepared to say there's no going back. We're going to organise, and we're going to restructure everything, and we're going to get rid of this capitalist system. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Bracing stuff as ever. Deliberately put you on last, not just that you were last on the list. I think it's great Terrific passion there. I think one of your achievements is to sell my mother a copy of the Socialist Worker magazine, and I thought that was a fantastic achievement. Seeing it on her coffee table for about a month after that was brilliant, so well done.
She should subscribe.
I'll have a word with her. I think she's an unlikely subscriber, but you know, she's 86. We're still working on her. Brilliant. But you talk about a great transformation in society. That's what I think is what we need. We need to come out of this crisis. We're going to come out of it. I said at the beginning, we don't want to go back to where we were. We're going to come out of it in a much different way that enables us to. Is that me?
No, sorry, it's this thing's going off.
Right. Okay, yeah. We need to come out of it in a much more positive way. Brilliant. I'm gonna now throw it open. I think if everyone back, Elfried, are you with us? I'm just looking at the panel. I think we've got all of the panel still with us. We're going to move over to question and answer now for our panel members. We've got Steve, Elfried, Martin, Mark and Kevin here. So we've got 5 panel members. Hopefully there will be a few questions. I'm hoping to wrap this up at about 4:30. Well, at 4:30, because I've got something else on soon after that. If you want to ask a question, we've got a dozen or so people in the room. If you can, I think the best thing to do would be to, I've got you all on, or I can see you all. That is brilliant. You can either raise your hand or your physical hand in the screen, or you can, under reactions, you can put a thumb up, or you can put your, where's the blue hand button? I don't know where that is, but if you can indicate to me that you want to ask a question. So who would like to kick off, and we can move the debate forward with a few questions and answers? I'm looking down my list. We have Wendy. You managed to put your blue hand up, so brilliant. I'm still struggling to find where that is, but thank you for that. You are unmuted, so go far away.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the connection between the food industry and the climate crisis, and also the pandemic. I think that what we're seeing across the world now is a growing monopolisation of the food industry, of farming industry, of what we would now call agribusiness, where massive, great big companies such as Monsanto control huge amounts of land and the methods of farming. They control the supplies of the pesticides and the seeds. They've managed to develop sterile seeds so that you can only grow the crop once, and then you have to go and buy more seeds to grow the crop again the following year. And I think the whole global food industry is part of the problem with the climate. You can see that, and also causing the pandemic. So you can see that peasant farmers have been, their land's been bought up by the big companies, and they've been forced to go further into the wilderness, into the wild areas where the viruses live, and they have been forced into closer contact with the viruses and the wild animals that carry the viruses, and that is part of the problem why we're seeing pandemics. Also, the monoculture, not just of crops, but also of livestock, and we know from the analysis of the avian flu, I think it was the avian flu, that the bug that caused the problem had come from 2 strains of a virus that was found in geese and one that was found in quails. And it was by zoonosis, had jumped species and mutated and caused absolute mayhem in the human populations where the virus was spreading. So this is a massive problem in the world, and also what the food industry does is produces enormous, phenomenal amounts of waste. So that there's a study been done that the wasted food alone that never even gets to our shops, never mind into our houses, wasted food that's produced and then destroyed It's what is it? It's the third largest producer of emissions after the US economy and the Chinese economy. It's absolutely phenomenal. That's not even what we eat. That's what we never even see. So it's a global problem that we're facing. And I think that's why we're seeing such poor response around the country, because each individual nation is treating this as a personal attack, a national attack. Our government has been very jingoistic about it, and we can fight this together and all this nonsense. I think we do need to see it in terms of an international struggle. That's all.
Brilliant, thank you, Wendy. I was. It doesn't. If this was a council meeting, the chair would have leapt in and said, "Where's your question, Wendy Smith?" Because that's what we're told when we go into debate or discuss something. But that's fantastic points. You're just as welcome making a statement, a comment like that as asking a question. I think I will throw. If people want to we'll have a brief discussion on that. I think we'll start with Martin, but I just particularly recall the bird flu incident of about a decade ago, and how it all started. But I think the big issue there was it was human activity that caused its massive spread, and the same with foot and mouth of a decade before that. With the bird flu, there were tens of thousands of day-old chicks being driven from Hungary to Halton with the virus. And if that isn't just absolutely crazy, I don't know what is. And that is not even considering the animal welfare issues of day-old chicks doing 2,000-mile journeys. So let's open it up to, Martin, can I bring you in? There was quite a lot of reference to food and agriculture in there. And I think you're probably the most informed on our panel on that subject. So over to you, Martin.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a number of points then. We see food as a commodity now, not as a thing that people need to eat and enjoy, and the nutritional value of the food. We've seen continual drive down of price, and that drives down the production systems. If a farmer finds a way of enhancing the production, the price gets driven down. So the farmers are not benefiting out of this system. It's the supply chain and the retail end. We've got to actually connect people, and I hope through this disaster we're living through, actually people connect back with their food. We've seen huge amounts of people reaching out to farmers markets, direct retailing, and actually connecting people with food. We say, as just mentioned, we see over 40% of what's produced thrown away, which is ludicrous. It's either through the supply chain, the packaging, or the consumer. It's absolutely ludicrous. We use all the natural resources and land resources to then throw something away. If you're producing cars or any other manufactured item, you wouldn't throw nearly half of it as it leaves the production line. You'd find a way of using it and recycling it and doing something with it. It has value. Nature doesn't give us food as stapled little bags and all very even. Our mindset and our system says every carrot has to be the same or every product has to be the same. We should accept the beauty of what nature gives us in our food and our produce and eat all of it and enjoy the different varieties we have. And how do we get back to supply chains that work, and how do we connect people back with the food? I think there's huge amounts of that. Huge amounts of the UK consumed food was eaten out with no knowledge or responsibility of where that food was produced, what standards it was, what environmental standards it was. We have enough landscape to produce food in the UK to feed ourselves and others. We don't need to keep importing so much where we have little regard for other people's landscape and water resources. We hear so much from the farming industry and from others. We need to produce more food. There's all this big population. If the farmer's role is to produce food, that's what we should produce. Much of what farmers across the globe produce is feed. It's produce to feed livestock, produce to feed anaerobic digesters, bioethanol plants, and other things. If a farmer's role is to feed the nation and to feed the globe, let's use the landscape as sparingly and carefully as possible to feed the population. And then we can see what we do with the spare. But at the moment, we seem to have a production system that goes for output with little regard for nutritional value, and what we can spare within markets and do other things with the land we have. And we need to change that. A lot of this land could have more trees on and work within an arable system or within a livestock system. But we need to bring this up from the bottom, engage farmers, lots through the network are doing this. They've got different ideas, and it's giving them voice to actually get involved and sit around those meetings to put that other perspective of what can carry on. So I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. That's great. I'm not going to get every panel member to speak. I think the best thing to do, we're quite a small group now, is if you want to add to this element of the debate, please put your hand up and come in. So Richard, I'm going to bring Richard in first.
My question is for yeah, you've got. Yeah,
no, Richard, I'm sorry. If we could just, I just wanted to stay on this agricultural food theme just until everyone has had their say on it. That we may be ready to move on. If there's no more hands going up, I'll come straight back to you. Elfriede.
Well, I'm going to wisely say very little on this because clearly I'm not as experienced as Martin, and it really is very inspiring to listen to him, and I'm just enjoying that. But my only thoughts would be that, and this goes across the board, it's not just about food, but we need to be thinking more locally, because when people can see their food being produced, then they take an interest in it. And I think this also could go in the same way for energy and house production and everything. We need to take a more local attitude, and that will really help us move forward in a more sustainable way. As we've seen the pandemic roll out, we have all noticed the interest in our local food supply. Part of that was driven by demand, because as the supermarkets' shelves were unstocked, then people were looking for other places to buy food from. And those of us that already got a veg box, for example, from a local farm, were quite food secure. And then suddenly, those local businesses, local farmers were working flat out to provide local food, and people were eating local food and understanding and experiencing what a joy that is. So sometimes we talk about things in quite mundane terms. We're talking about feeding people, meeting people's needs, but I think it goes beyond that. It's about the enjoyment of the experience of being part of something decentralized and local, part of the community. So my plea would be that not only do we talk about meeting people's needs and discussing how we're going to feed people, but also the joy of getting a veg box, eating some British quinoa, knowing that it came from a local farm nearby, having a connection with the family that grew it, and understanding the processes. And if we can get a bit of that back, not only will we be more food secure, we'll also inject a lot more joy into our lives. Now, of course, if we eat well and from our own soil, then food is likely to be more expensive than the cost that we have been paying, because we haven't really been paying the true cost of our food. So if you go to Morrison's and buy a few pints of milk, it's pence. It's not possible for a farmer to run a sustainable business getting that kind of money for their product. So that is why equality comes into this issue as well, and we need to make sure that people can afford to feed themselves properly, so that people don't go without. So in that sense, it's quite a complicated issue. But the pandemic really has shown us that people really are interested in buying locally, and how quickly things can change.
Thank you, Elfriede. I think, yeah, what we've got to do is try and get people to retain these new habits once the restrictions are lifted. That's going to be really, really important and really challenging. We'll move off agriculture and food unless anyone puts their hand up in the next couple of seconds. And I'm going to go over to Richard now. Richard, would you like to come in with your next question?
Yeah, my question is from Mark Harrison. I have got another question for Steve Sprung, but I'll leave that till later. Mark, although the state has used what we could term in inverted commas some kind of socialist measures in the way that in fact that they've had to respond to the coronavirus emergency. Don't you think that in other ways that in fact they are actually deciding in a very kind of neoliberal way, and in terms of that in fact that is calibrated through a kind of a no-deal Brexit kind of in the sense that they're trying to protect an economy which they would need in that circumstances, in the sense that in fact that they're not prepared to change things in terms of universal credit, they're not prepared to change things on 0 hours contract. They're protecting the gig economy, so that you can see that in fact that even in these measures that in fact that they are trying to protect the model they want in a no-deal Brexit in which is what I believe is the main objective of this government. You can see that also in the way that they've handled the health issues as well, in terms of cooperation, in terms of where they may be integrating the private and the public sphere of the health system as well. But the other question is, I still think that in fact demand, I know there's a big question about it, the demand over universal income. I personally think that is a basic demand which would actually undermine the neoliberal project, and also would be provide a transition towards a much more democratic and more socialist orientated society, which takes advantage of this and can pit against in a post-COVID world. That's a question for Mark. I'll come back to Steve a bit later.
Are you okay to come back on that, Mark? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I mean, I think I agree with you. I think I don't agree with you that the government are developing socialist measures. I think they've been very, very pragmatic, and I think it's probably out of fear of uprising and resistance that any of the measures that they've done to protect workers and through the economy. But I think, I think it's, if we look at their response, it's part of their neoliberal and post-neoliberal project. I think one of the fascinating things was when they gave the contract for testing to Deloitte's, the huge conglomerate auditing company. And I think what we're going to see through the response to COVID is an increase in the privatisation within the NHS that's still very much on their agenda. I think, the other side of it is, and to pick up the disability issue, is that all the emergency measures that they've taken, whether it be around the Care Act, actually remove all the rights that disabled people have fought for and won over the last 30, 40 years. And they've taken them away at a stroke of a pen. Whether that be around, as I say, the Care Act and people's right to a service, or through the removal of young disabled people with so-called special needs, and the removal of the duties on local authorities to provide educational support to that group. So I think at every level, we should look critically at what the Tories are doing around the response to COVID. And I think, in terms of, we need to look at it through the lens that Naomi Klein outlined in her books around disaster capitalism, and how the capitalist class use shocks and disasters to develop their project to which increases the inequalities of wealth and power in society in their favour and redistributes wealth and power from below from the many to the few. There's a very important pamphlet written by Disabled People Against Cuts, written by Ellen Clifford, which is a critique of universal basic income. And I wouldn't support universal basic income at all. I think it's part of a neoliberal project, just in the way that universal credit is, to get rid of workers' rights and our rights. There are some elements of it that I do find attractive, particularly the removing of conditionality. But the issue is that being implemented by a Tory government, universal basic income will be set too low, and it will discriminate against disabled people, because disabled people will lose all their additional benefits that have actually removed some of the barriers to disabled people living as equal and active citizens. And they will go because they will say and argue that we can't have both, that it will be too expensive. So I really think, although it sounds popular and it sounds nice, I wouldn't trust universal basic income under a Labour government. So I certainly wouldn't trust it under a Tory government. I think, but I would recommend, if you look on Disabled People Against Cuts website and search for universal basic income, the pamphlet that Ellen Clifford wrote is a really comprehensive critique of universal credit, and I recommend it to you.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone else want to come in on this subject, or shall we move to Richard's question for Steve? Are you okay with that, Richard? Or is there anyone want to come back on this? First of all, raise your blue hand. I know how to do it now. I'm just going to raise mine. There you go. Oh no, I haven't. Richard, come back with your second question, I think.
Yeah, it's a question for Steve. The Lucas Combine Committee was, in its time, a very organised, trade union movement. The distinction between then and now is the fact we have a declining trade union movement, a declining manufacturing sector. How do you think that, in fact, that we can come back into present circumstances where we have where the declining manufacturing industry, and we live in the time of where we are at the moment? So, thank you very much.
Steve, are you okay to unmute and give that a go?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, obviously. I think, yeah, I don't think it's just a question of trade unions, a weaker trade union sector. I think it's, if you read Mike Cooley's writings, and Mike Cooley is one of the key people behind the Lucas Aerospace project, yeah? He talks about the fact that, because one thing you've got to recognize is not only were they a strong trade union organization, but they had the capacity to propose, to make the things that they did propose, right? They had people who were working the way, because the de-skilling and the takeover of computers technologically hadn't taken place to such an extent, yeah? So that they were in a situation where you had people who were designers within a company would work right across a whole, and this is talked about in the whole section of the film, the larger film. They would work with the people on the shop floor. So you'd have shop floor workers, skilled workers, workers who were computer designers, would all have to work together in developing the things they were making for Lucas. And that fed through into their alternative planning as well. So it wasn't the fact there was this separation between what you get now, probably within more industries, is you get an elite at the top, and then you get the mass of people working in it who are sort of disenfranchised. Yeah, okay. That's one difference. That was obviously one strength that they had. The second thing that they had was their capacity to be able to know that they could make things, that they were active they could become active citizens because they have this capacity in their working process and the skills that they had. One of the things Mike Cooley talked about is this process whereby, in a sense, through the development of technology, as technology has taken over more things and human knowledge has been sucked into technology, because his big thing was the whole question of, I don't know if you know about, people know about this, but Mike Cooley was very interested in the development of what he called human-centered technology. How is it possible to develop technology which enhances human skills rather than a technology which is developed, which is very top-down and controlling? And that's the kind of technology that's very much developed. And alongside that development, of course, what you get is a tendency for a creation of a passivity in people towards a culture of passivity, i.e. that things are done for people, a lot of it through technology, but that tendency that we're passive consumers, we're not active creators. And I think that's a very, that sense is probably as big a question or as big an issue as the question of the sort of weakness of the trade union movement at this point, relatively speaking. Yeah. But I would go back, I think, because there's a whole other load of questions to go in there, but I would go back, I think, to this question of how they worked as a process. And someone mentioned at one point, they talked about the short-termism of capitalism. Yeah. I think actually this is something that could also be applied politically to the left, actually. I mean, I would, associate myself with being left of the left. The tendency for, because quite a lot of people have said today, for instance, in the discussion today, we're in this crisis, the current crisis, and we need to come out of it. We can't just go back to business as usual. All of these things, sentiments I would agree with and want, obviously, yeah? But the question is, it seems to me, quite often there is this short-termism. We're reacting to things that come upon us, and COVID, as it comes upon everybody, not just us, it comes upon the capitalists, comes upon the whole system. It's another thing which we're just reacting to. It's almost like we get these discrete moments. Currently is COVID, and an earlier period it been something else, where we can't possibly go back. We have to use this. This is the moment of transformation and change. And what I was talking about earlier when I talked about the whole Lucas, the process of the Lucas project, was that idea that they worked over a very long sustained period. I mean, if you look at something like, I don't know if people have read, say, Raymond Williams' book, The Long Revolution, the idea that you're working over a long period of time. And when moments do arise, you've built up the capacity to be able to operate in that and have more control over it. Yeah, that's what the Lucas workers did. Over a long period of time, they developed that capacity in their circumstances, their concrete circumstances. Their circumstance was they worked in an arms company. Their circumstance was structural unemployment was coming along because of technology. They could see that hurtling towards them. We have such things hurtling towards us now, don't we? We have technology, just one element of what's hurtling towards us, right? And what they did was they prepared themselves and they prepared their workforce and educated people. This is what is taking place. And then came forward with solutions to that situation. This is going to happen to us if we just are passive. But we can propose to do this. And they succeeded in getting, 18,000 people on board to support that project. And in that project, it was notably successful because of a lot of reasons I've tried to talk about earlier on. But also they were successful relative to other trade unionists. Other trade unionists were decimated in the same situation. So let's talk about equals. The question was about the situation today, but let's first talk about then and equals. In the equal situation of then and there, other trade union organizations were completely decimated, lost hundreds of jobs. The Lucas Aerospace workers at the time when they ran their campaign for alternatives, they managed to build prototypes, alternatives, universities, etc. None of them actually got made, or they didn't manage to force the company because of, in the film tells you, because of Labour government, trade union, and company collusion. They didn't manage to force that. But what they did manage, they didn't lose one single job. And they didn't lose a single job because they had that plan. and it was it was impossible for the company to move against them with redundancies whilst they had that plan in place, because they could hold them to account, as it were. They could hold a sort of status quo situation only because of that plan. And I think if we look now for our situation, it's obviously in all areas, it's a very different world for lots of different reasons, different time. But I think that issue of the sort of the tendency for, we tend to envisage things in short term rather than this sense of how the way, I was just trying to talk to the way they work. The way they work was they developed, well, two sides to it. One is the fact that I think what was very interesting about Lucas Project at the time was it managed to mobilize and get support right across a very broad spectrum of society, right? Whether it was from trade unionists, obviously, Labour Party branches, but peace organisations, environmental organisations, churches, a whole swathe of society came on board around it because of the nature of what they were proposing. Do you know what I mean? They managed to get that support. And they managed to keep the whole thing going for like an 8-year campaign. And it was really, I think, the fact that they managed to spread out and work across a broad range of society. They linked in with research. They really developed their ideas and researched their ideas and really focused on something which was a project, which they made visible, as it were. They made visible to people. And I think that's the sort of thing which is needed. If the current COVID crisis will happen, we won't come out of this current crisis, I don't think, other than business as usual at the moment, because we haven't done the preparation. Our side has not prepared for it. I don't feel there's that kind of preparation, enough preparation. We're not in a strong position. If you look at it, I mean, the Tory government got elected not that long ago. The Labour leadership has gone AWOL. You know what I mean? It's like the sort of the preparedness of preparing people for what's happening, the world in which we're in, has not taken place. Unless that preparation takes place, and we find a way of creating that preparation in all, in all spheres, it's not going to change. I don't think things will change. I'm not, I don't say that I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just trying to the importance of finding a way of working more like the kind of way the Lucas workers worked. Now.
Thank you, Steve. That was a good, short, concise answer, but really, really fantastic stuff there. A bit of a somber warning as well, that because I think we've got to come out of this in a completely different manner to that we went in. But I do take your point that it's going to be tough, but we've got to do it. Kevin wanted to come back.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that really, except to say that I think I'd put the emphasis slightly differently. You see, I think it was ultimately, we couldn't get a breakthrough, could we? The last big upturn in our class fighting with the Lucas plan, and with indeed a whole lot of other things, which in the 70s was put back in its, was knocked back. It didn't win through. And it struck me that that was essentially a political question. It was essentially a question of, does there exist amongst working people, networks, influence of the idea that actually we don't have to put up with this, we can change it collectively. I think that's one of the reasons why we see we're at the impasse we're in at the moment, is that we couldn't. In terms of Labour Party, it faced its own people stabbing Jeremy Corbyn in the back. It faced a situation where we now know there was a conspiracy from the head office of the Labour Party to prevent Corbyn winning an election, to rubbish him. And therefore, I think that I think that we have to approach this question by saying, yes, we must plan. Yes, people have all sorts of ideas, and we must discuss those ideas, and we must pull together all the people who have expertise in different questions. All that is very important, but we have to ally it to a politics which says that from below, we must not allow ourselves to, if you like, be how shall I say, be pacified by the idea that Parliament is going to look into this, that the authorities in society are going to look into this. We've got to do it for ourselves. We've got to have a movement from below, and I think that's and we had the beginnings of that, but the political weakness was that we didn't have, the trade union movement was dominated by the top, which which funked it when it came to the big miners' strike and so on. They didn't provide the solidarity. They were hemmed in. They didn't want to break the rules. We have to have a situation where from below people say, well, if our leaders won't break the rules, we damn well will, because we need the solidarity to break through. It's a political question, in my view. Thank you, Kevin. I think we've got time for one more question. Is there anyone that wants to come in with one? If not, I'll ask one. But let's see. I can. Any hands up? Okay. I'm going to ask the last question then. How are we going to make positive change appeal to people? Simple question. Good one. Elfried's got her hand up. Do you want to come in on that? She's coming.
Thanks, Graham. I think this is really important, and it sort of goes back to what Kevin was just saying about how this needs to be a movement of people coming together. And that's been really difficult in recent years because people are just so sick of politics. Everyone's sick of it. Everyone's sick of the democracy we don't really have, and the locally and nationally. And really sadly, I include myself in that. I love politics, but I hate the way we do it, because politics should be about people and community, and shaping and transforming the communities that we live in. And we definitely don't have that at the moment. And I think some of the challenges could be alleviated by calling for genuine involvement from the people. So we were talking earlier about how, in the past, trade unions have been part of that and obviously have the potential to be in the future, but we can go beyond that with citizens' assemblies, communities coming together, are really valuing communities. We've seen that during the COVID-19 crisis in Beccles and all over Waveney. We've got hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who have signed up to offer support and help to other people in their communities because they desperately care about each other. And we should foster that and encourage it because it's such a wonderful feeling when we're all working together for a common value. We have so many skills in our community. We have so many problem solvers. We've got people working in artificial intelligence. We've got fantastic companies working on solar pumps. We've got amazing farmers looking for climate solutions. And all of these people should be actively engaged by our political system to look for solutions in the future. Because when we're all invested in something, we are more likely to fight for it. So here lies the problem. We have a political class who that would be the last thing they would ever want to do because they have a very set idea about how we should go forward, and they don't like hearing from other people, even fellow councillors on the opposition benches or opposition MPs who actually have been elected to provide that role. So telling them that skilled and intelligent people in their communities should be included today as well always goes down badly. But nonetheless, if we can explain to people that they have the right to be involved in their democracy to shape the future, I think that is relatively powerful and could become very powerful. I also believe that we need to explain to people that the future, by overcoming some of these issues that we have at the moment, to move forward, in the fight against the climate emergency can be very beneficial for everyone. We've talked about equality today, and one of the things that we can do is massively reduce inequality across the world and in our own country. And I'm just going to really briefly go through a few areas because I want the opportunity to listen to everyone else. But if we're talking about housing, well, then we can eradicate fuel poverty by changing the kind of adapting and changing the kind of housing we have. Almost overnight, we could do that. We could do that in a year across the whole, or a couple of years across the whole country, if we really, really wanted to. And whilst doing that, we create jobs. We create really good jobs for people by supporting and increasing an industry. And we can do the same with farming. We can do the same with our energy. We can start producing our own energy in communities and being in control of it, which would be incredibly empowering for people and make us all live differently. And I think there was elements of that in the film we watched earlier about allowing communities to start producing for their own needs, and not always having to pay through the nose for everything, because they are the producers and they are in control of their own lives, which would be a really wonderful, wonderful way to live. This will become essential as we move forward, because we know that supply of electricity, for example, is very vulnerable at the moment, and there's not even and our national grid system is very, very ineffective, and we need to move forward to smart grid. So some of this we will be forced to do. Even the powers that be at the moment will accept that we have to change, and that little small opportunity there is our chance to come in at that moment and make sure the change is as great as it possibly can be. And I think that's where opportunity lies. It's about being positive about the future. It's about empowering people and giving people, supporting people to step up and believe in themselves and the skills that they have to offer.
Thank you, Elfriede. I thought that was. I thought I'd give you a couple of minutes, but I think there was a bit longer than that. But that's brilliant. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, not a problem. Not a problem. Wendy, I know, wanted to come in on that and answer the question or respond to Elfriede. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, I'll start with your question. I just think that there are, during the crisis, there are things that have come to the forefront, if you look for them, that are reasons to be cheerful. So the first thing is the mutual aid support groups that have sprung up all over the country. About, I don't know, 5,000 estimated mutual support groups out of nowhere, when just ordinary people have said, I don't trust the government, I don't trust the councils, I'm going to do this, who's with me? And people have gone, yeah, I'll join you, I'll do that. And they've organised their own networks to distribute the food, to find the food, to find out what other things people need, to go and fetch prescriptions. Nobody's told them what to do. They aren't qualified to do this job. It's not their day job. They've just gone out and done it because they saw that it needed to be done. This is people responding to human need. This is socialism. This is proper socialism. People, you don't empower people, not power, if you have to be given it. You have to seize it. You empower yourself. People empower themselves. And that's what's happened with those mutual support groups. They're fabulous. The other thing is the gradual politicisation of the clap for carers on Thursday evening. I don't know where it's like where you are. I know it's patchy and some places it's dying off, but I know that where I live and where a lot of other people I know live, it's getting more and more political every week. And people are shouting, you know, PPE, test. People don't go to work to die, all that kind of thing. And although political protest's really difficult in lockdown, that is one way we can do it. You can take your placards out there, you can home make banners, get an old sheet and paint on it, whatever, to use those daily claps to pull your neighbours behind you in a little fight back of your own to just show how angry this whole thing has made us feel. And the final thing I wanted to talk about was Tuesday's Workers' Memorial Day, where health workers protested outside their hospitals. And because obviously health workers don't necessarily have to social distance because they're working at close proximity with each other all the time. But people were able to go and stand at a distance and applaud and protest with them. And there is a fight back going on. Essential workers up and down the country, whether they're in a union or not, have stood up to the management and said, this isn't safe, we're not going to do this work, we're off. Sorting offices, we saw one in Bury St Edmunds, they walked out just because they had tried to introduce a new workstation and there wasn't the space for that workstation to ensure that everybody was safe. They walked out, the management backed down. There's fabulous struggles taking place, and it's in struggle when people change their perception of the world that we live in and what's right and what's wrong and who's got the real power. And we've got to work on that. We've got to organise that, and we've got to keep that going so that when they try and get us out of the lockdown, we support every group of workers who says, I'm not going back, it's not safe. I'm not going back until it's safe. And we have to do that as a trade council, as a May Day organisation committee everywhere. That's the way we change things.
Brilliant. I think that's an excellent wind up to the debate. Actually, I think that's a fantastic wrapping it all up and concluding. I mean, I'd just like to just say thank you to everyone. We are losing people as they're leaving. Nearly everyone is leaving a message of thanks to the panel. Some specific people have been mentioned, but some, all of you. So thank you very much for your participation. The film, Steve, is on at 7 o'clock tonight. I think Kevin will share a card at the end with the link. There it is. And all that leaves me to say is stay well, look after yourselves, look after your neighbours, look after your friends. And
Graham, could you just invite them to tomorrow's May Day meeting as well?
I'm really, really sorry. Richard, would you like to do that? Because you know the details.
I'll leave it to you. Well, no, I'll leave it to you.
Okay. I need to just pull up the details. Bear with me.
If you're stuck, there is a oh dear. There's the Facebook link. There's the Facebook link on the I'm getting a funny noise here. I don't know what's going on. Let's try it again. Oh, sorry. There's if you look on the card that's in front of you, there's that Facebook link, tinyurl.com Waveney May Day. If you go to that Facebook page, that will have all the details of tomorrow's stuff on it.
Brilliant. I'm going to direct you to that because I can't put it up on my screen. I can't copy and paste that. That's a JPEG image. But there is poetry, there is music, there is all sorts of fun things happening. And please have a look at it. You've got the URL there, and it will be live on YouTube as well.
I just go with it. Maybe I'll just try and do it just a bit verbatim, really a bit. Yeah, basically, it's a poetry festival, music festival. It's introduced by Dean Parkin, who's a well-known poet and writer who's very much involved in wrote a book about the Grit, which was the old sea village in Lowestoft. He's chairing it, and then we've got he's been doing a film. Then there'll be poetry from Hellsworth Swans and other musicians from Norwich, and then also we've got John Ward Band, who's playing at 4 o'clock. And then there'll be a break for lunch, well, for dinner really at 4:30, and then come back in the evening at 7 o'clock when we've got Hugh Standers from Norwich will be playing. They'll be introduced by Dean Parkin again, and then we've got music from Brighton, and we've also got it follows up with the Little Red King, which is Jason, who will be giving will be on music as well. So that is basically starts from at 2 o'clock and goes through to possibly between 7 and 10. So if you can look on the website, you'll be able to see downloaded the full breakdown of the event.
Thank you, Richard. That was much better than I could have done. Much more knowledgeable on what's happening tomorrow. Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone.
I would like to thank, because obviously it's something I initiated, and I'd like to thank all the participants who've agreed to come forward to participate in this debate. The only thing that I'm a bit concerned about is that, in fact, that really, considering the widespread of social media outlets, that in fact, to be honest, the maximum maybe was 14 participants, which is not very good, really, to be honest. A bit poor, really, but no doubt people will be able to watch it on the YouTube, maybe, as well. So that there's a possibility there. But I think there's one negative aspect of this, in the sense that although we've done a widespread of publicity, that in fact that not that many have actually attended to come to listen to the debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. I've got to go. I know most people have actually gone now because they've fallen off one by one. So I'll say goodbye and thank you.
Cheers.
Take care all.